Hello, and welcome to Lesson 12, Part 2 of A.K. Warder's Grammar Guide and Introduction to Pali. In this tutorial, we're now going to move on and look at relative and interrogative pronouns. And we'll start with the section on relatives. This is Pali Studies on the Learn Pali channel. Okay, first let's be clear what we're talking about. Relative pronouns are words like who, what, which, whose, where, or when in English. But these are not words that ask questions, which are called interrogatives. A relative pronoun is one which begins a relative clause. And a relative clause is also called an adjectival clause because it qualifies either the subject or the object of the sentence, often specifying who or what it is we're talking about. The first thing to note is that the clauses actually express two separate thoughts which are linked by a common thing. So we can split this sentence into two. The man was my father, and the same man visited yesterday. And it's this noun phrase, the man, that the relative clause is qualifying. Technically, this is referred to as the antecedent. The antecedent is what the relative pronoun who is referring to. Now, I've covered relative pronouns and clauses in other tutorials in some detail, so I'm only going to recap here. It's more usual in English to embed relative clauses, in which case the antecedent is immediately followed by the relative clause, and the rest of the sentence then follows. And we can also add a second pronoun to the main clause, and this pronoun is called a correlative. Notice that the relative and the correlative pronouns both reference or point back to the antecedent. Okay. Now we're armed with some terminology, let's start our look at relative pronouns in Pali. First, let's recall the forms of the demonstrative pronouns that are based on the stem ta. And I've included in this table some of the more common forms in the ablative and locative case. Warder hasn't introduced us to these yet. Now, in Pali, relative terms are formed on the stem ya, and these have the same pattern as the ta pronouns. But don't get too hung up on the declensions, as these can always be looked up. And now if we look at an example in Pali, the first thing to note is that the relative clause will be marked by a relative pronoun of the stem ya, and more often than not, the main clause will also have a matching demonstrative of the stem ta, and so this is also sometimes called the demonstrative clause. As a general rule in Pali, the qualifier comes before the qualified, so a relative clause usually comes before the demonstrative. The order can be reversed for emphasis, but it's never embedded as in English. The key to parsing a relative sentence is to identify the antecedent, the person or thing being qualified. So there are some simple rules which help here. First, if the antecedent is an explicit noun, it will be placed in the relative clause, so that's the first place we'll look. Second, the relative pronoun and the correlative must agree with this antecedent in gender and number, but not necessarily case. So we must first look for a noun in the relative clause that agrees with both the pronouns in gender and number. Here it is the man. So to reconstruct this in English, we place the antecedent at the head of the sentence, and then follow this by an appropriate relative term to embed the relative phrase, and then complete this with the demonstrative clause. Finally, we can often drop the correlative pronoun in English too. The man who I saw is called Jyotipala. Possibly more common, relative clauses can be used impersonally, which means there's no explicit antecedent, or the antecedent itself is a pronoun. In this case, the correlative pronoun becomes the antecedent term. So if we look at this example, we can see that there are no verbs, so the two clauses are equational, there is an implied copula linking the nouns. And in this example you can see quite nicely how the second pronoun picks up on what the first pronoun relates. What is impermanent, that is suffering. This sentence makes sense as it is, but if we were to embed the relative clause, we can see how it's now the correlative term which takes on the role of the antecedent. It's the correlative now which is placed at the head of the sentence, which is then followed by the relative clause, and finally completed by the demonstrative clause. If we take another example, here there's no noun in the relative clause that agrees with the pronouns, so we can place the correlative at the head of the sentence. Bhagavantang here is an accusative, so the Blessed One is the one being seen. And we complete this with the demonstrative clause from which we can drop the correlative pronoun. They who see the Blessed One do not lament. Now I think it's worth pointing out that in Pali the form of the relative term is based on case, whereas English has different terms based on what is being referred to, the exception here being whose, which is a genitive term. But for the others there is no one-to-one translation. We have to choose the right English term based on what the antecedent is, a person, a thing, time, place or reason, etc. Okay. It's also important to realise that the pronouns in each clause take their case based on the function that the antecedent plays in that clause. In this example, the antecedent is the king. In the relative clause, the pronoun is nominative masculine, as is the king, so the king is the subject of the verb to sleep. But in the main clause, the pronoun is in the accusative case, and so the king will be the object of the verb to ask. Sometimes when I'm unsure about a relative clause, it's useful to isolate the antecedent and form the two clauses separately, like we did in the first example in English. So in this example we get the king sleeps and they ask the king. Now if we bring these together, it actually makes more sense to append the relative clause rather than embed it, so we get they ask the king who sleeps. And if we now look at Warder's example, both pronouns agree in gender and number with the noun the gate in the relative clause. So this is the antecedent and we can place it at the head of the sentence, followed by a suitable relative pronoun, and the rest of the relative clause. And we complete it by appending the demonstrative clause. Nama here is an old indeclinable form meaning by name, and dropping the final correlative we get the gate by which he went was named Gautama Gate. Another quirk of pronouns that you may come across is repetition. Repeated demonstratives can imply variety, this and that, here and there, while repeated relatives imply generality, whoever, whatever, wherever. And note that in a relative clause construction, when the relative term is repeated, the correlative term will also be repeated. And finally, sometimes what looks like a declined pronoun form may in fact be an adverb, or more correctly, is a pronoun being used adverbially. I'm not going to go into the indeclinable relative terms here, there's already a detailed tutorial on them, except to highlight one case, that of the yena-tena clause construct. This is often found with verbs of motion, and it's a common way of expressing a destination. Yena and tena here, although looking like instrumentals, they're actually adverbs meaning where and there. So this is quite a common type of construction. The destination is placed in the yena clause, where, and the person or thing moving is in the tena clause. And usually we can just append the relative clause to the end of the main clause. I wish to go by the path he came. Anyway, please check out that tutorial on relative adverbs. Now we're going to move on to the interrogative. These again decline similar to the pronoun stem tar, but are based on the root ka. Now the term interrogative means to ask a question. So an interrogative sentence is one that asks a question. But we can achieve this in several ways, one of which is to head the sentence with an interrogative pronoun or adverb. But yes and no questions can simply be implied by reordering the sentence, placing the verb first. Or what's called an interrogative particle can be inserted. And yes, these are actually auxiliary verbs, but I'm using them to build a comparison for Pali. So now in Pali, there's no equivalent of a question mark. However, we can identify a question because Pali follows a similar pattern to that just outlined. One way is to use an interrogative pronoun or adverb, and as a pronoun proper, they stand in for the person or thing being asked about, and so take the gender and number of that thing. But the case of the pronoun indicates the role that it plays in the sentence. So here kang is accusative because it represents the object of the verb. And in English we tend to move this to the head of the sentence. What does the Buddha teach? And if we quickly look at an example in the dative, this is for the benefit of whom does the Buddha teach? And an example in the genitive, and this could equally be whose goat is this? Finally, pronouns can also act as what's called a pronominal adjective. That's when they act as a unit and specify a noun, in which case they agree with that noun like an adjective, in gender, number and case. Occasionally, word order is used to indicate a question. Placing the verb first in a sentence can render it interrogative. So if the straight indicative sentence is you go to the city, then placing the verb first we get go you to the city? But note that a verb can come first just to add emphasis, so when we're faced with a sentence where the verb comes first, we have to decide by the context whether it's a question or whether it's merely emphatic. And frequently Pali uses the interrogative particles api and nu. Api actually has many uses, but when used as an interrogative particle, it will come first in the sentence. Whereas the particle nu is actually enclitic, which results in it usually being the second word in the sentence. This example translates literally as, I am not a warrior. But with the interrogative particle, we may render this, am I not a warrior? Or, can I not be a warrior? Okay, there's actually a whole separate tutorial on this, so I'm not going to go into any more details here. Well, that brings us to the end of Lesson 12. Warder presents us with some more vocab, and for those wanting flashcards, there's a link down in the description below, as there's always been, to the Memrise website. And I've recently added Bhante Subhuti's Anki deck for chapters 1 through 10. And finally, of course, the answers to exercise 11 can be found on the Wisdom and Wonders website. Okay, lesson 13 follows next week, and of course in the meantime, there's plenty more Pali language tutorials.